Thank you very much for your invitation to this conference and the opportunity to participate in this conference, and thank you for the introduction. I want to make for this topic, human dignity and religious education, one preliminary remark. The German education system follows the understanding of human dignity as a concept of equality of all human beings, like we talked about this day, and it follows likewise the concept of autonomy of the person. Heinz-Gerhard Justenhofen presented it just before. I think that underlies the understanding on the whole what I will talk about to you. The idea of human dignity finds its expression in the concept and understanding of education that underlies state education in Germany and is reflected, for example, in school curricula. Thus, in 2013, curriculum for Catholic religious education at the grammar school, we call it Gymnasium, states, quotation, religious education emphasizes the dignity of the individual as a person loved by God, beyond any functionality and utility. Education in the Christian context aims to realize the destiny of the human being decreed by God to live in freedom. The understanding of education that underlies education at school is shaped by two things: the acquisition of material knowledge on the one hand, and the understanding aimed more at the development of a person and her subjectivity on the other. Decisive here are the guiding principles that are foregrounded, namely of the freedom and equality of all human beings, and therefore of the equal rights of all human beings to education and the promotion of their subjectivity and self-determination. Theologically, this understanding is based on the idea that the human being is created in God's image. Since all people are images of God and blessed by God with spirit and freedom, they are also capable to leading their lives consciously and autonomously. The personality and uniqueness of the individual is anchored theologically in the divine likeness of the human being, which ensures the dignity of every individual. Besides imparting necessary material knowledge, such an understanding of education thereby also serves as a model for the goals of the state education system. I want to argue here that religious education, which in Germany is part of the state education system, contributes to educational goals such as facilitating freedom, participation, and the assumption of responsibility for the community. It is ultimately to what we today define as civil society. Thus, by promoting competencies and attitudes, religious education contributes, albeit indirectly, to human dignity as an all-encompassing yardstick to guide individual action and the state. To clarify matters, I will first make some comments on religious education in the German education system. Then, drawing on a justification of religious education in the public sphere and the demands that are made on it in a modern society, I will address the potential that religious education has. First, unlike in many other European countries, religious education in Germany is a proper subject as every state school, and it is taught separately according to each respective denomination or religion. This is precisely what marks out religious education in Germany. Since religious education is anchored in Article 7.3 of the German Constitution and is taught according to denomination, it has been afforded a high status in the education system. As a so-called res mixta, responsibility for what is taught lies with the respected churches, Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox, or with the religious communities. There is also Jewish religious education, and for some years now we have Islamic religious education. The infrastructure, such as the training of teachers, is provided by the state at university training facilities, faculties, and institutes of theology. Also, responsibility for what is taught lies with church or religious community. Teaching is, of course, not permitted to contradict the principles of the democratic constitutional state. Furthermore, religious teaching at school is not to be understood as a so-called teaching or learning in. It is exclusively as an introduction to the respective confession. Rather, religious education is part of the state's educational mandate, and as such not only serves the interests of the churches, but is also geared both to the target group, the pupils, and to the mandate itself, which aims to involve citizens in the democratic community. It was for this reason that the Church Synod of the Würzburg Synod made a clear distinction at the beginnings of the 17th between catechesis as religious instruction, which its location in the church community on the one hand, and religious teaching as a site of religious education on the other. According to the Würzburg Synod, religious teaching in the sense of a religious education is therefore directed not only at the devout pupil, but also at the questioning, doubting, and searching pupil. It does not necessarily want to lead the pupil to a religious affirmation of faith, but rather to the formation of religious judgment and to well-founded decisions about religion, at the level both of the individual person and of society as a whole. This also touches on the justification and legitimation of religious education in the state education system with its own proper school subject administered jointly by churches or religious communities and the state. This has pedagogical implications and explains the reciprocal inherent relationship between religion and education. It is why religion is a genuine component of education and cannot be excluded from it, and why religion in turn is also dependent on education. First, religion as a component of education. The first argument is based on the close connection between religion and culture. As a rule, culture cannot be understood without knowing something about the religion or religions found there. Accordingly, religious education also makes a decisive contribution to understanding the respective culture shaped by religion and the shaping of religion by culture. Another argument is that every person has to interpret her existence, herself, and her life in this world, and to grapple with the existential questions of her life. To do so, she does not have to turn to religious interpretations today. But when it comes to an existential question of self and world, to coping with contingency or to relations with the other, that is, when social relations and practices of recognition are central, then religion is an ancient system of interpretation that the person can use to interpret the self and the world. And even if religion today has become just one system of interpretation among others, it remains an essential form of rationality for discovering self and world. The educationist Jürgen Baumert has distinguished 4 different approaches to the world, which he assigns to different school subjects. The normative evaluative approach deals with the key question of how to order the world reliably and focuses on society, politics, and economy. The cognitive instrumental approach deals with the question of how the world works, and it is focused more on mathematics and the natural sciences. The aesthetic expressive approach focuses on the question of how to express reality and focuses on literature, art, and other forms of creative expression. And finally, constitutive rationality, which focuses on existential questions and thus on philosophy and religion. These four modes of understanding the world represent approaches to the world that are different but complementary and mutually irreplaceable. It is only in their interaction that they represent the entire horizon of understanding self, world, and reality. If education has a task not only of imparting material knowledge, but also of enabling people to understand herself, the world, and the reality, then education should take account of all four rationalities. Thus, the grammar school curriculum also states, quotation, "It is therefore the task of religious education to give young people access to religious interpretations of the world and ways of life, and to enable them to think and act responsible with regard to religion and faith." End of quotation. That means that as a constitutive approach to the world, religion is a genuine and inherent component of education which legitimizes and justifies the presence of religious education in the public space of society and in the state education system. Conversely, religion also needs education. On the one hand, it is an essential task of education, and especially of religious education, to give religion a rational basis. For besides the act of faith itself, this faith should be also understood cognitively. It is important to know what is believed, so that religion does not become simply magic and believers fall victim to any form of religious idealization. This is formulated in the curricula as follows, quotation, "This also includes a rational statement of the faith and a rational explanation for the decision of faith. In its claim to rationality, church faith thus distances itself not only from relativistic arbitrariness, but also from any fundamentalism." Quotation end. On the other hand, it is the task of religious education to fact whom, why it can make sense at all to engage in the venture of faith, and how this venture can be explained rationally. Education should not shy away here from the criticism of religious traditions. Ultimately, religious education draws attention to the fact that faith is essentially practice, way of life, and attitude to life, and is therefore tied to concrete action. Religious education reflects this practice of faith in a quest for good practice, and she does it not abstractly, but concretely in different and also changing social, societal, and cultural context. And finally, being able to shape social coexistence, to act with an intercultural and interreligious competence, requires not only an effective affirmative approach to religion, but above all a cognitive reflection on religion, and especially on one's own religion. The religious education, my second point, before the challenges of modern society. The goals of religious education in the curricula of the different school forms and grades, as they are formulated under the auspices of the churches, are related on the one hand to a basic religious education, a so-called religious literacy, and on the other to empowering people to help shape the community and social coexistence. This is what the grammar school curriculum says, quotation, "Within the general task of all subjects, religious education in particular also contributes as part of its development of pupils' competence to shape the future to the critical reflection on gender and cultural stereotypes, to the inculcation of values, to empathy and solidarity, to developing social responsibility, to shaping a democratic society, to safeguarding the natural foundations of life, sustainable development for future generations too, and to co-shaping culture. It also contributes to intercultural understanding. Quotation end. Today's modern society is very much shaped by plurality, by different religious traditions, and in Germany at present above all by Islam, but also by the fact that people have no religion or are indifferent to religion. Many people are no longer religious, do not practice religion, and do not make use of religious systems of interpretation to understand their lives. But it is not only religious traditions that have become more plural. Cultural traditions and way of living are also becoming more plural as a result of processes of modernization and above all of migration. To take account of this, a central competence has shifted in recent years to the Center of Religious Pedagogy, namely the competence in pluralism and heterogeneity. It is no longer possible to see religious teaching solely as an introduction to a particular religious confession. If this was possible in the 1960s due to the high degree of congruence of Christians and population in their values, ways of life, etc., such a pure teaching in or learning in is today no longer conceivable within the framework of a state education system. Rather, it is a question today of perceiving and reflecting on the characteristics of modern society and exploring the potential that Christians can bring to society. This places the spotlight much more on learning from, how we call it in our discipline, by which it is meant the individual's personal exploration of her own religiosity and her exploration of theology. What can be learned from and with religion can help the individual participate in society and learn responsibility both for herself and for coexistence in society. It is therefore also a question of what religion can and does contribute to successful coexistence in civil society. Increasing plurality and this learning from have been taken into account in religious pedagogy in the recent years by a discourse that deals intensively with the phenomena of plurality in the sense of diversity and heterogeneity. This discourse views such diversity in terms not only of phenomena that exist side by side, but also of attitudes, position, and ways of living that are in relationships of tension and contradiction with one another. It is more important than ever today that processes of religious education also enable pupils to perceive, but above all to deal with plurality and heterogeneity in their different dimensions. This requires reflection on religious, social, cultural, sexual, ethnic, and gender diversity, and on the category of disability and ability. These categories of diversity must also be incorporated into the learning process with the aim of sensitizing pupils to the diversity and reducing prejudices, enabling them ultimately to deal democratically with religious, cultural, social, and gender-related diversity. Not all categories simply exist side by side. Rather, what is also required is a critical normative factor, since not every difference and every practice is right and can be accepted simply because it is different. An education based on teaching the power of judgment requires clarifying and critically questioning the categories of diversity and difference, since difference is also partly constructed and is not simply a given. This becomes clear, for example, in the category of difference of social origin and the discrimination based on this. Assuming this difference to be manifest and given would be a tantamount of cynicism. Furthermore, religious education is also always normative, and in this respect must also search for a universalizing and ultimately normative factor to enable a criteriology for the formation of judgment. Given the fact of plurality and the goal of fostering the capacity of plurality, such a factor cannot be captured materially. Rather, it must be sought in a more formal way, without thereby disavowing one's own religious standards. Such a factor can be seen in the combination of recognition and justice, since practices of recognition are based on the inalienable dignity and uniqueness of the human being, and on the fact of the human being as a free subject who can relate to herself and to others. According to the theological understanding of education that I outlined at the beginning, this recognition applies to every human being as a human being, with the factor of social justice already being inscribed with recognition. In turn, as a normative factor, justice introduces a critical corrective that it directs not only at people, but also at structures and relationships, namely by drawing attention to structures and relationships that are recognized prematurely and that contradict justice. Justice also reminds us that the right of all, and not just of the individual, must be taken into account equally, and that the goods of recognition must be distributed fairly and universally. Given the accelerating processes of religious and ideological pluralization, and given the importance that religion has regained in society in recent decades, all people require a basic competence in religion, a religious literacy, so to speak, since in order to be able to understand our societies and to deal with religious phenomena, it is always necessary to have a competence in religion, as well as a reflective attitude towards one's own religiosity and towards religion in general. However, to make successful coexistence possible and to participate in shaping society, it is also necessary to be able to deal in an appreciative way with diversity and with precisely what does not correspond to oneself. Religion and religious education can make a decisive contribution here and can thereby contribute to the basic democratic constitution of society. This is not to use religion or to reduce it to ethics. It is to release its potential to build peace. Thank you very much.